So we're going to go to Professor Ted Postol, who is a good friend of the International Peace Coalition. He is a professor emeritus of MIT and is the leading expert, as Helga was saying, on nuclear weapons. And we are very appreciative of you joining us today to give your expertise. Please go ahead, Professor
Well,
Postol, you have the floor.
well, thank you very much, Anastasia and Helga, and our other co-defendants. Um, the When Helga mentioned to me, basically, I think it was only a week ago, that she wanted me to come on and talk. I think neither of us could predict the catastrophic events that have gone on literally in the last few days. We are in a situation where U.S. President Donald Trump has made some extraordinary statements and taken some actions that I think have seriously damaged the prospects for any kind of constructive diplomatic progress between Russia and the United States. Hopefully, this can be walked back, but to be quite frank, I just don't see how this could happen at this point. But I will be pleased as punch if this turns out uh, to be possible. But the timing of President Trump's statements are especially problematic because the in February, the end of February, the uh, the New START treaty will need to be renewed, and of course that cannot happen quickly. And President Putin has very wisely offered that Russia would follow the New START treaty provisions for a year while the United States and Russia uh, went through the negotiations to extend that treaty. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was lost a few years ago, would also really also needs to be put back in place, or something that will prevent the large scale emplacement of short range nuclear weapons in Europe, which will dramatically increase the chances of an accidental nuclear war. And I think it uh, it's it's very unfortunate. But as far as I can tell, and I hope somebody will explain to me why I'm wrong. I'm happy to be shown to be wrong on these things. I think that Russia has now been put in a situation by the actions of President Trump where it really has no choice but to solve its legitimate security concerns uh, through the battlefield in Ukraine. And I think this is extremely unfortunate. There will be a tremendous additional loss of life that could have been avoided. And and I think it's quite possible that Ukraine will essentially be destroyed in the process because the political leadership of Ukraine is so extremist that it really should be compared to Hitler in his bunker when the Soviet Union was closing in on Berlin, and Hitler refused to stop the slaughter, and in fact even ordered Albert Speer, his master of the economics, he's a head of the German economic effort, to really destroy what was remaining of Germany. Fortunately, Speer was not willing to do it. But We are in an extraordinarily dangerous situation now. And I find it hard to believe, to be blunt, hard to believe that anybody could have such a lack of grasp of history and such a lack of grasp of basic facts that they could behave like Frederick Merz has been behaving in Germany. And of course, this also includes Emmanuel Macron, and Keir Starmer in France and the UK. This is I have to say I've been trained as a physicist, not a historian, and when I read history, I always had trouble quite viscerally understanding how the political leaders at the time could show such stupidity. But now it has been made very real to me by looking at these people. So, in any case, we are in a difficult situation. Now, the what I'd like to do during the remainder of this talk, and I have to ask Helga to interrupt me because I could go longer, and I don't think I should. So I'm going to try to keep it short. I want to re-emphasize for the audience how tremendously dangerous and damaging nuclear weapons are. And the reason this is important to understand, and I think it's important to understand this on more than an abstract level. I mean, you to really understand this on a basic level is extremely important. Can you see the slides? And can you see the cursor? The
Yes, we can see it
Okay,
now.
good. The the destructive nuclear weapons, the destructive effects of nuclear weapons are really so large and they're so extensive that a nuclear war will effectively end modern civilization. This is almost a fact of the physical world, and I would argue it's in fact the physical effects are undeniable. I mean and I'll show you a few of them. I won't go through a full discussion because there needs to be time for uh, lots of other subjects to be covered. But I want to make a very important point. This is an existential fact of physical reality. This is not a policy viewpoint. This is not an opinion that can be argued on the basis of perceptions. This is simply a fact of physics. And when somebody tries to suggest that a nuclear war can be thought of as no different than some kind of limited conventional war, and that people will walk away from this damaged but not completely destroyed, they really have no idea of what they're talking about. They are either ignorant beyond belief or they are reckless beyond belief or both. And this is one of the reasons why I am so concerned about statements made by Merz and Macron and Starmer. I mean, these people need to sit down and spend some time understanding what the simple effects of nuclear weapons are. They wouldn't talk the way they would if they understood it. There's no debate to be had on that. But a very important point that comes from this tremendous destructive capability of nuclear weapons is that there's no such thing as fighting and winning a nuclear war. It's simply not possible. Helga brought up a statement that was made by a former commander of Strategic Air Command, Air Command where he defined winning as having more nuclear weapons than the adversary has after the war occurs. Now, this is unbelievably idiotic. What basically this commander was saying is that the United States would be a smoking, radiating ruin, and Europe and Russia would be a smoking, radiating ruin where almost everybody would be dead or dying. But winning would mean that the United States might have some submarine in the North Atlantic or in the Pacific with a few more nuclear weapons than the Russians might or might not have. This is his definition of winning. This is uh, I, this is a kind of immoral um, uh, disguise for arguing that something that would be the end of human civilization is a trivial event. This is immoral to. I don't know how to begin saying what I think about the morality of these kinds of misleading arguments. It is no different than telling people, go ahead and use that bridge, even though you know the bridge will collapse if the people try to use it. This is nothing, nobody who has the job of protecting the United States, let alone other countries, from the consequences of the complete destruction should ever be allowed to make these kinds of statements and be treated as if they are a responsible person. I just don't know how to begin to make my views more clear on this. And I have worked with people like this. I have worked in the Pentagon, and I have worked with commanders of strategic command. And I can only say that this is the most reckless, ignorant, dangerous kind of statements to be making. And the reason you can't necessarily win a nuclear war is simply because winning would mean that somebody has something of human value left after this war. And if human civilization is destroyed, there is nothing of human value left. It's all gone. And um, this is why the effects of nuclear weapons, which are physical and not disputable, I would be pleased to have this commander of strategic command explain why what some of the things I am about to show you are not true. Let him try. Let's do this. And the important thing about these destructive effects of nuclear weapons is that they are so destructive that they have a social and military consequence that goes beyond the physical. And that is that any time you start using them, they are so destructive that anybody involved in making decisions about these weapons being used, will be forced to use these weapons against the other adversary. They will have no choice because they will have no choice but to try to attack the other's forces and stop them from destroying their own country. And because both sides will have this imperative because of the destructive of nuclear weapons, a very small number of nuclear weapons being used, perhaps even one, would very quickly start an action reaction cycle that would begin the destructive, the destruction of human civilization almost instantly. And we have experience with this. We in 1983, excuse me, in 1983, we had a war game called Able Archer. And in the war game, of course, then there was East Germany, and West Germany. In the war game, it was postulated. Remember, this is a game. So the game postulated a nuclear attack by the Warsaw Pact that began against East Germany. West Germany. And basically, what happened is there were 10 or 11 small. These little circles show you a 1 to 15. I'd say for purposes here, we'll just assume that they're 15 kiloton nuclear weapons. These are weapons that could be fired from artillery pieces, so they're very low yield. They're the kind of weapon that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because today we have much larger weapons. I'll show you what these so-called small nuclear weapons can do very shortly. And in this process, it is assumed by by the by the war game referees that these 11 nuclear weapons are used, and then the American team or the Western team, which incidentally consisted of of an American Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and an American chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So the highest level people were involved in this war game. And of course, there was a Russian or uh, um, Eastern European team that was supposed to replicate what the Eastern European reaction might be. And within one day, there were over 100 weapons used. There were counter strikes and counter strikes done. So we had roughly 100 nuclear weapons of the yield that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki being used. Now, of course, if you think of World War II, and this had been, and the United States had been able to do this to Japan, Japan would not exist at that point, would simply have not existed. These weapons would have destroyed all of Japan easily, without doubt. Now, by day three, so now we're talking 48 hours after this initial incident, or day five, let's go to day five, this exercise had escalated into thousands of nuclear warheads being used basically in Northern Europe. And what you see here are these multiple circled points are strategic nuclear weapons, are sort of in the 1 megaton range. These smaller nuclear weapons are 75 to 100 kiloton nuclear weapons that might be called theater nuclear weapons, and the rest is all these smaller weapons, any one of which would have destroyed a city like Berlin or Hamburg or Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So I'll show you a little bit more. So this is a war game. This was driven. This near instant, as incidentally, the war game ended at day five because what's not shown here is it escalated to the strategic use of nuclear weapons by the then Soviet Union and then the United States. So by day five, both countries no longer existed, along with Northern Europe being completely destroyed. So, so in 5 days, the destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons caused both sides to escalate with civilian oversight, senior civilian oversight, into a nuclear war that ended civilization. It would have ended civilization if it had actually occurred. So what what I've done here is simply chosen the theater nuclear bombs and shown radiation patterns that would, I have to assume wind speeds, so wind directions and speeds. So the real situation could be very different. But these little red areas show where the areas where people downwind of these theater nuclear attacks could be could suffer enough radiation exposure to die. These people could suffer this exposure within one day. The blue area shows the area where people would suffer enough exposure to be very, very sick. Many of these people would die because they don't have medical attention, because you need massive amounts of medical attention if you are severely poisoned by nuclear weapons. Of course, you can see that the smaller nuclear weapons would essentially cover the entire area with lethal radiation in Western and Eastern Germany. And of course, I haven't even filled in the larger radiation patterns from the higher yield weapons. This is just a minor nuclear exchange. So the um, the reality is that nuclear weapons are so destructive that even a small number of them being used will almost certainly, I want to underscore that escalation is a near certainty because of the characteristics of these weapons, force the military decision makers involved to escalate in the desperate hope, in the empty hope that they can stop the other side from doing existential damage to their country. So you have these two effects that are really can be traced back to the unbelievable destructive capability of nuclear weapons. Now, just to give you a quick understanding of this, and then I'll stop, is here is a satellite image of Berlin and the surrounding area. What I've done is put a circle of 5 kilometers around the center of Berlin, and what I've then assumed that Berlin is attacked by a single Russian 800 kiloton warhead. So this is the strategic warhead. You saw a whole bunch of those strategic warheads being used. And just to give you a feel for how serious uh, the weapons buildup has been, is the actual detonation would could well occur. We don't know how it would occur because there are many choices a Russian adversary could make, but might well occur where the nuclear weapon gets set off at an altitude of about 2 kilometers altitude above the center of the city. These little dash that you see here shows you the precision with which this nuclear weapon could be delivered. And as you'll see, this precision is ridiculously high because the destructive effects are impressively large in area. But this high precision is due to the fact that both sides have built weapons of high precision to attack the weapons of the other side. This is so, this guarantees escalation since both sides could well uh, attack the other's nuclear weapons or try to attack them in the hope of stopping the other side from doing lethal damage to their society. When the nuclear weapon goes off, it releases an enormous amount of energy within a very small volume of space. And the initial temperature inside the weapon is roughly about 100 million degrees Kelvin. Now, the center of the sun is about 20 million degrees Kelvin, and the surface of the sun is about 6,000 degrees Kelvin. So you can imagine that this enormous small region of hundreds of meters of hundreds of cubic meters, so it's very small, that has a temperature of uh, of of much larger than the center of the sun, will become superheated and will expand violently outward as the hot gases want, because the pressure of the hot gases inside is so great. And the initial expansion will be at millions of kilometers per hour, but it will eventually expand into a ball of superheated atmosphere of about 2 kilometers, a little bit over 2 kilometers in diameter. And that will take about 1 second. So what you're seeing here is the fireball is at about 1 second after the detonation has occurred. Inside the fireball, the density of the air is about 1% that of the air in the surrounding atmosphere because the air is so hot that it is expanded until the pressure inside the ball of superheated air is equal to the pressure outside. So now you have a bubble in the atmosphere. And the average temperature of this bubble is about 8,000 degrees Kelvin. The surface of the sun is about 6,000 degrees. So the fireball radiates about 2 to 3 times more light and heat than the equivalent area of the surface of the sun. So what I've shown down here at the bottom is a cloud that is a cloud created by the explosive disintegration of areas exposed to the tremendous amount of light and heat. So, for example, on the ground, the asphalt on streets would be vaporizing into gas. Fantastic effects. The concrete buildings, the surface of concrete buildings would be superheated so fast that and because they're brittle, they would thermally expand so fast that they would disintegrate into superheated powder that would recoil out from the surfaces. This is a phenomenon that is literally a phenomenon that could only occur in an astronomical environment, but of course, it's occurring near the ground, near the surface of the Earth. At the same time, this fireball has expanded into into a bubble in the air. It has acted like a fast-moving piston pushing against the surrounding air. So it creates a compressed shock wave of enormous physical extent. Now, keep in mind that most of you were probably thinking about the nuclear weapon mostly doing damage by the blast wave. But note that extraordinary damage, much greater than what can be done by the blast wave that will be arriving behind the hot flash from the nuclear fireball, is done well before the shock wave actually even reaches the ground. So the shock wave is much less damaging and lethal than the actual flash of light and heat from the fireball. As the shock wave expands outward, it uh, it it it, uh, it it generates a reflected shock off the ground. In other words, the primary shock hits the ground and and results in a reflected shock that comes out that follows the primary shock. And sorry. And this primary and secondary shock coalesce at a region called the Mach stem, the Mach front. And at this region, you have an adding of the shock wave, an addition of the blast from each of the shock waves, both uh, adding together to increase the shock on the ground. Just to give you a sense of how serious the blast pressure is, keeping in mind that more damage has been done initially by the flash of thermal energy. Um, the um, the shock wave at this point at near 5 kilometers will be accompanied by a 250 to 300 kilometer per hour wind 300 kilometer per hour wind, and a very high blast overpressure, which I'll show you uh, right now what would happen to a structure. So if we just look at a structure at this 5 kilometer range, so this is a structure, what we would first see is at a tenth of a second after the detonation, the fireball is very bright and beginning to get brighter. It will get at its maximum brightness in 1 second. So you see this structure is lit from the front by the fireball, and then as the fireball gets brighter, you can see the front of the structure is burning off. Now, of course, light is shining inside into the structure. So inside the structure, curtains are being set on fire, rugs are being set on fire. If people are in line of sight of the fireball, they are being severely and fatally burnt, um, uh, literally, so their skin becomes charcoal like. And of course, in a real city, there would be other buildings around, uh, trees, shrubs, all kinds of vegetation that would be set on fire, all of that simultaneously. Now, after, so this is 1 second, 10 seconds after this event, the shock wave would be arriving. So now we're seeing the shock wave. So this is pretty late in time, 11 seconds after the detonation, 10 seconds after the front of the building burnt off. You can see the front of the shock wave is acting on the building, and it's tearing off the roof tiles as it moves across the top of the building. And at the same time, this shock wave is accompanied by these 300 kilometer per hour winds, which of course tear the building to pieces. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that this is only a secondary lethal effect of this detonation, because what you would actually see is here's before a detonation. You see the whole ground is now smoke. The uh, poles are now smoke, and this leads to tremendous destruction from a fire of extraordinary scale that gets initiated immediately. Just again to underscore that the light and heat are so serious. This shows you a school bus being subjected to the light and heat from the nuclear detonation. This could easily occur at 7 or 8 kilometers from the detonation point. Here you see the ground exploding into flames, trees exploding into flames. This is a tent which would look like which would be similar to what a tree would be doing. So the light and heat is extraordinarily intense. Again, to give you a feel, because this is beyond normal human intuition, and that's what I'm trying to help you understand how violently this light flash and how lethal this light flash is. This is a piece of material that was exposed to the light flash of the fireball at Hiroshima. And you can see it was light and dark stripes. The light material reflected enough light and heat from the fireball that it generally did not ignite, but the black material absorbed light and heat preferentially, and you can see that it was preferentially ignited relative to the light material just because of its absorption characteristics. Here again, you see a very sheer, beautiful material with flowers that were sewn into it. And here again, you see this material after being exposed to the light of the fireball. And you can see that these flowers were preferentially burnt out of the material because the light material at this particular range, of course, everything would have burst into flames at a shorter range. Um, the light material reflected enough light and heat that it did not catch fire, melt, or combust. And this phenomenon leads to these extraordinary burns that were found on victims of the nuclear attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This woman, this unfortunate victim, um, she had some kind of material uh, pulled over her shoulder. Uh, there was a dark and light pattern. The dark material either burst into flames or melted onto her skin. The light material reflected enough of the light from the fireball away that those parts of her skin were preserved. And but she certainly died of her burns and radiation exposure, actually, uh, within probably several days of the nuclear attack. Hopefully, several days. Otherwise, she could have suffered for weeks before dying. And the same fate was suffered by this unfortunate victim. She had a heavy something. She was carrying something. It was a hot day. She had some kind of light clothing on. She was burnt through the clothing, similar to what would have occurred to anybody who was wearing that sheer material that I showed you earlier. And she had some kind of heavy strap across her back and shoulders, and that prevented the light and heat getting through. Of course, she also would have died from exposure to the heat and the consequences of the fireball. So I'll make one more point here and then I'll end. Um, so the the fireball will set fires over a vast area, and the um, the area of the area over over Berlin would be just to show you here. This is the area of Berlin for those of you who know Berlin, who flew. This is the area that would be essentially set on fire all at once. So you're talking about an area of maybe 50, 600 or 700 square kilometers at fire, on fire all at once. This is not a fire like the fire that destroyed San Francisco in 1906, or the terrible fires in Hamburg, which destroyed Hamburg. This Everything is on fire at once. And when you have a situation like this, you have uh, uh, a situation where an enormous amount of air, of hot air, is being produced by the fire, and cool air is being drawn in from the surrounding environment. And this cool air, because so much area is generating so much buoyantly rising air, the wind speeds will be hurricane force. I want to underscore that. You're talking about hurricane force wind speeds, 150 kilometer per hour wind speeds in the fire zone. And because the wind gets almost instantly heated by the fire, by the burning, by the combustion in this zone, it almost instantly gets raised to above the boiling point of water. So, so the uh, the effect of these fires and the buoyantly rising air is to cause winds that cause the fire to coalesce into a gigantic, powerful firestorm that is driven not by the weather, but by the buoyantly rising superheated air of the fire. And you can see this kind of phenomena. This is this is actually a small fire on a monument. You can see the way the flames are being pulled in by the moving air moving in from the outside. Here is an actual large scale forest fire. And here again is another. Let me, I will just push ahead here. I'm going to go ahead. Here is another firestorm, but this is a much less intense firestorm than would occur in a city like Berlin because this is a forest fire. And the amount of combustible material per unit area in a forest is much lower than what occurs, than what is the situation in a city. And you can see that the winds generated by the fire are uneven. And so you get, in this case, you get a tornado, a fire tornado generated of that's extraordinarily severe in this large area. So this area would be literally hell on earth. And hell is the right description, almost in the biblical sense. The net result of these intense fires is that if people try to escape on their feet, they die in the superheated air. This is an example of somebody who tried to escape in Hamburg. And this is another example of people who were caught in the open. And here is an example of what happened to people who stayed in shelters where they were essentially heated, died first by carbon monoxide poisoning, and then the shelter heated because the firestorm occurred for so many hours that the heat from above filtered into the shelter and turned it into a uh, an oven. So I'll stop here, but my point is simple. I want to reiterate this point. The destructive effects of nuclear weapons are vast. They are not simply like those from a limited conventional war, which themselves are horrifying. A limited conventional war with modern weapons, and modern weapons include World War II, is a horrifying existential consequence that destroys civilization wherever it occurs. The scale here will not be simply that of a war that occurs that's limited to Western Europe, like what occurred in World War II, mostly limited to Western Europe. This will be global. And anybody who thinks that winning a nuclear war is simply that um, the people on both sides who are left in this state will have somebody roaming around the North Atlantic with more nuclear weapons than the people left in this state in the Eastern Europe and Western Europe, that is winning the war is delusionary beyond belief and reckless beyond belief. There is no winning such a nuclear war, and the very small limited use of nuclear weapons will almost instantaneously drive the military on both sides to do what they don't want to do. If you talk to military officers who know what they're doing, not like this strategic commander who made these extraordinarily unwise statements. If you talk to soldiers who know what they're doing, and there are such people, They will tell you that winning a nuclear war is a fiction, is delusion, and a very dangerous delusion at that. And I'll stop here. Sorry for the gruesome character of what I'm showing, but I think uh, it's good it's important for people to understand what we're dealing with.
No, I thank you, Ted, for your presentation, for really making this real for everyone.
I think it needs
It's
to be real.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I apologize for the brutality of the presentation, but I want to assure you that I've selected from a very large number of illustrative slides, only a few, so I can make my points. I'm not trying to just go through slide after slide. I'm trying to make it real to you because if it's real, it has more meaning than something that we all abstractly think we understand. And I'm hopeful that I'll be giving a talk later in December. We're trying to arrange a talk to the European Union. I don't know what will happen, but I'm trying to get a friend of mine, a Russian general officer who's experienced with the strategic rocket forces, to talk along with me. And I hope we'll be able to do that and just see what a rational, thoughtful military officer who has dealt with these nuclear weapons from the Russian perspective is, how sober he is as well, and how serious the danger is to all of us, the common danger.
Well, I personally, and I'm sure others here, definitely look forward to hearing a report from that meeting that you have.
Well, let's hope
Um,
we can arrange it. We're trying to.
yeah, yeah.
People
No,
don't
that's
want to hear
excellent.
about this. The European Union, European Parliament doesn't want to hear about this. So the person who is trying to arrange this is fighting to get this arranged for a talk at the European Parliament.
Well, maybe others who are on this discussion can assist who have
Well,
connections in this area. Maybe they
we'll
can.
see. Uh,
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And
Helga
definitely,
Helga's Helga is one of the culprits involved in this. So uh, contact her, or and if you think you can help induce the European Parliament to at least listen, so they understand what they're dealing with. That the constituents that they're responsible for representing, that they understand what they're dealing with, for their own for their own constituents to understand.
no, exactly. And just so you know, there are people I'm getting messages, texts, and emails asking if people can have access to your slides. Obviously, they would give you credit.
Very, very happy to do it. Can I send you the slides and have you redistribute them, or
Yes.
would that be?
Yes,
Uh, I'd
absolutely.
be
You
happy to
can.
do that. There are a lot more slides in the presentation. Obviously, I skipped over quite a bit, and you're welcome to them. And those of you who have additional questions, you can write me directly and ask. If you think I can help illuminate some of the
Yes, and we definitely
issues.
have questions coming in, and
I'm
we'll
sure.
we'll get to those in just a moment. I want to go to Helga. If you have any responses or thoughts before we move on to some of the questions.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for having made this presentation because I think, anybody who does not think about that is not in the real world. Now, I have a couple of thoughts. One of them, obviously, is that several people who participated in the maneuver Able Archer were telling afterwards that the consideration of what would be the effect on Germany did not play any role in those conducting this maneuver. If you could comment on that. Then, furthermore, I have another point. Um, what do you think about the present armament going on in Europe? Because as far as I can see, this is all supposed to be for a conventional war. But it is my view that if this present escalation is continued, we are not going to have a conventional war with Russia. We are going to have a nuclear war, because it is very clear that the reason, at least I think it's clear to me, I hope I'm right, that the reason why President Putin changed a year ago the Russian nuclear doctrine was because they somehow realized that the doctrine as it was up to that point was not sufficient to deter a potential opponent from, basically going over any red line one after the other. So Putin, about a year ago, changed the doctrine to say that Russia will only use nuclear weapons. Before it was Russia will only use nuclear weapons when the existence of the Russian state is at stake. And he changed that to say that even if a conventional country is threatening, a conventionally armed country is threatening the existence of the Russian state, which is backed by a nuclear power, then under that condition, if the existence of Russia is at stake, Russia would preserve the right to use nuclear weapons. Now, that condition obviously is referring to the situation in Ukraine, and in the countries backing it is naturally the United States, Great Britain, France. So what is your view? Are the Europeans then causing an illusion that they are telling people we have to have a conventional armament for a war which will not take place in the form they somehow say, or they don't elaborate it, but is it not a complete illusion? Because once you push Russia into what they call a strategic defeat, Russia will not accept that, and in that case will use nuclear weapon. If you could comment on these kinds of problems, please.
Yeah, well, uh, let me first make a comment that I think is very important, from my point of view, the most important thing. Uh, Germany is now being subjected to a strategic deception, and I say deception, by its political leadership and the American leadership. There has been this claim that in 2026, the US and Germany will have mobile conventional strike weapons placed in Germany. Let me assure your audience, as a person who's worked in the Pentagon and who knows something about these weapons, that we are not talking about non-nuclear weapons. All right. This is a lie that has been conjured up by Merz and his political cohorts in Germany. It's from, just to be, I'm not a German citizen, but I am an American, and the Americans are involved in this. And this is a deception that the is aimed at putting mobile nuclear weapons into Germany. And the Russians will understand this. They understand it already. They've made statements about it. They will treat these weapons as nuclear because they have to be. Because if you sat down as a military analyst and you looked at the number of these weapons that would be going in, they have no meaning. In other words, the capacity for these weapons to do any damage that's significant is near zero if they're not nuclear armed. If they're nuclear armed, they can do quite a bit. And so there is no question, from the point of view of a military analyst, whether you're Russian or American, those weapons will be nuclear armed. And this is an incredibly dishonest and cynical thing to be doing to your own population. You're betraying your own population, because the German population has a right to know that these weapons will be treated as nuclear weapons and that they will be nuclear weapons, so that the German public can decide for itself whether or not it wants to put up with or suffer the tremendously increased risk of a nuclear war that will start on German soil if these weapons are put into Germany. There's all this talk about democracy versus autocracy. There's all this nonsense about how democratic the West is. Well, this is not democracy. This is autocratic. There is there is suppression going on all around, and the result is political leaders are using these opportunities to suppress free speech, to put in place very, very dangerous mechanisms that will tremendously increase the chance of a spark leading to a global nuclear war almost instantly. And this needs to be stopped and it needs to be exposed. So let me make that point first. As for all of this uh, talk about going to war with Russia, it, it's almost laughable when you look at the current situation. Um, Russia clearly has no intent to occupy Western Europe. In fact, they clearly have no intent to occupy Ukraine. They have been forced by virtue of the American and British and Western European behavior to take territory in Ukraine in order to deal with the existential security problem that has confronted them because of the behavior of the West. All that Russia wanted in January of 2022 was to know that nuclear weapons and American forces would not be put into Ukraine under the guise of NATO expansion. And in January of 2022, Anthony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, told Sergei Lavrov that the United States reserved the right to put nuclear weapons into Ukraine, and that it was none of Russia's business. Well, should anybody be surprised that in in February, weeks after Blinken told Lavrov that the United States really intended to put nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that Russia invaded Ukraine? I mean, why should anybody? Those who are inclined to ascribe uh, tremendously high levels of immorality to the Russian decision to invade, because war is an immoral activity. And I do think it's immoral to start a war, but you start a war because the consequences of not having the war will be much more serious if you don't have the war. And that was a decision that was made by Russia that, frankly, I would have made in the position of the Russians, because if I were a decision maker advising John Kennedy in 1962 about whether the United States should tolerate nuclear weapons, Russian nuclear weapons in Cuba, I would have fully supported the Americans sending in the U.S. Marines and invading Cuba to have those Russian nuclear weapons removed. Fortunately, Khrushchev showed the great wisdom of backing off from a mistake he knew he made. And I say he understood that he had made a terrible mistake, and he was courageous enough to recognize that this was a mistake and negotiate a way of getting, of stopping an American invasion of Cuba, which would have certainly occurred if Khrushchev had not negotiated with Kennedy to remove those weapons. The great courage and foresight that Khrushchev showed after he made this mistake of inserting these weapons should be applauded by everybody. It's generally not done, but it was a very courageous uh, move to correct his mistake. And why should Russia put up with a more dangerous and threatening situation of nuclear weapons even closer to their national capital and decision-making centers than Cuba was for the United States? Why should they do that? And this is exactly the reflection of security concerns that I ask anybody, including these people in the European Parliament, to explain to me why Russia was wrong when they were given no alternative by the West but to invade Ukraine. And if you look at their actions, uh, they were driven by U.S. and British and Western reactions to continue a war that they did not want. They were happy to pull out. They made it clear that they would have pulled out of Ukraine. And they did, in fact, start pulling out when the Americans and British came in and told the Ukrainian Zelensky that you're on your own. We will not support you in any way if you agree to the negotiation you just entered with Russia that is causing them to now pull out. And it was the Americans and the British who stopped the Russian withdrawal and forced the Russians to do what they did not want to do, which was to have a full-scale war in Ukraine. And this is the kind of leadership we're dealing with now. And this is what these people want to do again. And unfortunately, what can happen again could be a war that we will not be able to recover from, that will end civilization. We need to do something to stop these people.
Thank you, Ted. And
Please.
Helga, I know you had a little bit more.
Yeah, let me just come back to the question I was asking earlier. I mean, why are they then? I mean, what is your explanation? They're putting enormous amounts of money into conventional armament. They're cutting social expenditures. They're ruining Germany as a social state. I mean, isn't that completely insane?
Well, I mean, uh, the current situation in Germany, also true in France and Britain, but to varying degrees. Britain is actually in worse shape than Germany. France is not quite yet in as bad shape, but will be. Uh, the uh, the economic situation in Germany is a result of this Ukraine war. The United the United States destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. The argument was to show you how idiotic and ill-informed President Biden was, and how reckless he was. He did more damage to the country that he thought was an ally, in this case, Germany, France, and UK, than he did to Russia, because Russia was in a position to not sell oil and gas through the Nord Stream pipeline to Germany. But Germany was not in a position to not have oil and gas from Russia, because the German economy screeched to a halt because of the loss of inexpensive oil and gas. And for the last 3 years, the German economy has had essentially zero gross domestic product growth. Germany is in the process of deindustrializing. If I were a leader of Germany, like Mr. Friedrich Merz is supposed to be, my first concern would be my people, my country, and my economy. And he's not concerned with that. Instead, he wants to further ruin the German economy and the German social system by diverting limited funds in a deindustrializing economy, which is deindustrializing as we sit here, away from the people of Germany to build weapons to prepare for a war that does not have to occur and should not occur. There's no reason for a war with Russia. The Russians are not interested in occupying or attacking Germany, France, or Great Britain. You have these leaders who are so desperate to cover up their disastrous decisions that have caused this economic collapse across Europe that they are willing to try to instigate a war and further damage the well being of all of their people by creating a false argument for a future war. This is extraordinary. And it is extraordinary that the so called democratic governments we have do not have mechanisms for stopping them. So when people want to talk about democracy in the West, I mean, this is nonsense. The average German does not want this. The polls show it. You know, it's ridiculous. There is no threat from Russia. So what we have is a group of political leaders who are ignorant, who have done terrible, terrible things to their own people economically, and who are now trying to cover it up by arguing that there needs to be a war with Russia when Russia poses no threat. That's what's happening. I don't know if that answers your question, Helga, but
I can only say, that we will ask all participants in this call, to make sure that a video or transcript of what you are saying gets to everybody, especially, the Bundeswehr is now going around in the schools advertising voluntary joining the army for pupils. And, I mean, I know that these pupils are being told absolutely wrong reasons, that they get money, that they get good pay, that they can maybe even learn their profession, study. And I think this is adding to the betrayal, because I mean, even the officials places are now saying, yeah, if it comes to a war, 1,000 casualties per day need to be replaced. So therefore, we have to recruit more young people. I mean, is that a reason to join the army? Especially in light of what you just said, there is zero chance if it comes to that. So I think we should do everything possible that that analysis you just gave us gets
well,
to
let me make a
everybody.
let me make a point. There will not be thousands of casualties per day. There will be millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of casualties per day because this war will not remain limited to non-nuclear conventional weapons. So anybody who thinks it's only going to be thousands or tens of thousands of people per day is just wrong. It's tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people per day. And that is the real truth of what this war would bring.
Thank you for making that starkly clear for everyone here on this discussion. And we will make sure that your presentation is available as a standalone so people can share this, get this out. It is immediately available on the Schiller-Institut YouTube page, and people definitely should get this out far and wide. Please just give credit to the International Peace Coalition so we can continue to grow the process. And I will also make your slides available to people who are part of this discussion. Clearly, people very much want to get this out. Um, so, Helga, unless there's anything more that you'd like to go through, um,
And to take the possibility of other people to ask questions to Dr. Postol.
wonderful.
Well, thank
Okay,
you.
so we will make the transition to the audience now. I want to encourage people who are on Rumble, Zoom, Twitter, whatever other platform people are on who are watching this. If you'd like to participate during the discussion period with Ted Postal, please register for the Zoom meeting. You must be registered to participate. You can go to the schillerinstitute.com website, and right on the top of the page of the website is an RSVP page. Just sign up. You'll get the Zoom link emailed to you, and you'll be able to join. Please use your full name when you do join. And with that, Dave, just let me know when we have cut the stream.